I don't think China is going to invade Taiwan in 2027. That is the date that Xi Jinping set for his army to be ready to invade. And if they wait a little bit, maybe they can buy Taiwan instead of invade Taiwan. I think the biggest lesson that China has learned from the Iran war is that larger countries with experience in conflict have failed at conflict, so they might not be any different. If you think about it, war is kind of like that crazy girl that all of your friends know and all of your friends have tried to date. And it just hasn't worked out for any of them. But somehow you are going to be able to fix her. It doesn't happen with that crazy girl in your friend group. And it's not going to happen with China and Taiwan either. If you take a look at Russia, they tried dating the crazy girl. They invaded Ukraine. They thought, oh, this war is going to be easy, 3-day special military operation, and they couldn't fix her. If you take a look at Israel, they weren't able to defeat 5 brigades of militia inside of Gaza. They weren't able to fix her. If you take a look at the United States and Iran, the United States beat the tar out of Iran's military forces, and we do have some ships moving in the Strait of Hormuz now under escort, but it's essentially like we hung a noose around the Ayatollah's neck and then we attached it to a sapling and planted the tree, and it's going to take a little while for that thing to grow so we can hang him. We essentially lost our political will to fight in Iran. And so I think that the thing that China has taken away from this is that war is hard, and why are they going to be any different if they try to capture Taiwan? So it might actually be easier to buy Taiwan by encouraging the KMT, which is a political party in Taiwan that is a little more pro-China than the current DPP political party. And if they wait a little bit, maybe they can buy Taiwan instead of invade Taiwan. I don't think China is going to invade Taiwan in 2027. That is the date that Xi Jinping set for his army to be ready to invade. And when a dictator tells you what he's going to do, you should believe him. But there's a couple of factors that kind of come into play now. The first is, like I said before, that maybe China is looking at conflict around the globe and saying, you know what, we might not be able to fix her either. Second thing is JADO, or Joint All-Domain Operations. China just received a masterclass in America's new strategy called JADO. Now, if you think about traditional conflict, a lot of times you have multiple airstrikes and then you have a ground invasion. So you have a hurricane followed by a tidal wave. America's current doctrine, called JADO, or Joint All-Domain Operations, is essentially 1,000 tornadoes on day one. So that means we are launching cyber attacks. We are launching missiles from the ground, from subsurface, from the air. We are performing amphibious landings. We are doing everything all at once, and we have the ability to control that. That's not something China has ever had to deal with before. So now they have to stop and they have to rethink, wow, JADO worked. We essentially eliminated Iran's air defense in roughly 36 to 48 hours. Now, granted, China's air defense is a little more robust, but it is unproven. And if we're not going after air defense, there may be other targets we're going after. So when China takes a look at the totality of the circumstances, they have to deal with JADO, they have to deal with the difficulty of war in general, and then they have to cross a 100-mile ocean, I guess 160 or so kilometers if you like football, right? And they have to deal with the logistics of moving stuff to that island of Taiwan, and that's going to be extremely difficult even under ideal conditions. Add to that in 2 windows, roughly April, May, when the sea state of the ocean is relatively, is not as rough as it normally is, and October, that's another window where the sea state is low enough for an invasion. So you have 2 windows. You have a giant porcupine that is Taiwan. You have a massive ocean, massive strait that you have to cross, and then keep crossing while Americans and Taiwanese are shooting at you, and you're dealing with the fact that war is harder now than it's ever been due to the proliferation of small, cheap drones. I mean, we've seen small, cheap drones in use in Sudan. So I think that's really changed China's calculation as to when it might want to invade, if it chooses to do so, and it just might be easier to hope for an election victory of a more pro-China party and kind of go that route instead of go the route of conflict. I think the biggest thing to worry about is Xi Jinping's age. When you're in your 70s, there's not a lot of space left on the actuarial tables, right? So at this point, he might be thinking of what is my legacy. And if he wants his legacy to be the reunification of a rogue province, that's when we need to get worried that he might instruct his army, look, I want to do this because I want this to be part of my legacy. I know there's a lot of disadvantages. Make it happen anyway. And when you are the commander of the military, that is your prerogative to say that. Yes, China can sit back and learn more things, but you know who else is learning things? We are. We've learned so much about air defense in the past couple of years, not only from Ukraine, but from conflicts in Israel and defending ourselves inside the Arabian theater of war. So we've learned a lot from that. We've learned that, yeah, you know what? We can have small, cheap drones like the Lucas drone as a stand-in for what would have been needed for a Tomahawk just a couple of years ago. We've learned how to build cheaper systems. We've learned that the advanced precision kill weapon, which is essentially a 2.75-inch rocket with laser guidance on it, that can be used very effectively to kill small, cheap drones by aircraft and helicopters. So yes, China is learning things, but we're learning things as well. And kind of the difference here is that we've actually engaged in actual combat, which is our trial by fire to figure out what works and what doesn't. So essentially, there's 5 major bases: Ulsan, Kusan in Korea, Kadena Air Base, and Iwani Marine Corps Naval Air Station in Okinawa, Japan, and Andersen Air Base in Guam. If China chooses to invade Taiwan, those air bases have to be destroyed because they are very, very close to China, and we would be able to launch strikes from those bases, which means those bases cannot remain untouched. And it is very likely that China will launch massive ballistic missile, drone, or perhaps even commando raids, if they can get away with it, to take out facilities at those bases to render them unusable. If China decides to wait for an attack on Taiwan, it might actually be advantageous to Russia because they're getting a lot of their components from China. They're getting a lot of their hard currency from China as well. So you can imagine that whenever China decides to attack Taiwan, they're going to be cut off from the rest of the world. So fuel stops, trade stops, grain stops, and the only fuel source is essentially going to be Russia, but China has to pay them somehow. So they have to pay them in hard currency or gold. If they have enough gold reserves, that's not that much of a problem. But the advantage that Russia has right now is Chinese components that are dual use. So someone might buy drones directly from China, or they might buy computer chips that are placed inside of washing machines and sent over to Russia as consumer goods. You open it up, there's a bunch of computer chips inside that they can put inside their drones. If China is not in an active war against Taiwan or against the United States, or whatever coalition we decide to build, it's going to be a lot easier for Russia to source those components from China. If a war kicks off, China might like to sell those components, but it could be using those components for its own in-house military, for their own drones, for their own systems. So if a war kicked off between China and Taiwan, that might be a lot more difficult for Russia to source their parts. So it would be a disadvantage for Russia if China actually invaded Taiwan. So I guess there's essentially two ways it could theoretically escalate. If China wanted to, it could try to perform a blockade of Taiwan. Right now, Americans are mainly focused on the Middle East. A lot of our naval power is over in the Middle East. And a lot of those ships that have been at sea for 6 months, 9 months, they need to go back to have their crew swapped out and repairs performed on those ships. Now, that doesn't mean America can't somehow surge naval ships and aircraft carriers over to Taiwan to try to break some kind of blockade, but it does make things significantly more difficult. So that is one option. They could try to perform a blockade just to test the resolve. And since right now, America hasn't been the greatest friend to our allies, for justified reasons. I mean, NATO really does need to spend 5% on defense. But we're going to have to rely on our allies if we're going to stand up to China. And those allies will be Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, the United Kingdom, and France. Those would be ideal. Although the United Kingdom has some problems with their Navy right now, they could afford to float a couple of ships over. So if we're angering our allies right now, this would be an ideal time to try to test that blockade theory, because there might not be a lot of countries that might come to Taiwan's aid or to America's aid if we're trying to lead this coalition. Second option is the option of just buying Taiwan. You know, right now, there are elections scheduled in Taiwan for 2028. There's two major parties, the DPP and the KMT. Right now, the DPP is in power. The KMT has people who tend to look for a more non-adversarial relationship with China. And if the Kuomintang KPP or the KMP is elected, you could see closer relations with China, and that's how China kind of softly gets the nose under the camel's tent for just a soft buying of Taiwan, integrating them slowly through votes and through elections. If there's one thing that you should probably take away from all of this, it's that war is hard. Even for countries that do it all the time, like the United States. You would think we would have perfected this by now, but it's still extremely difficult. And for a country like China, who has had essentially no experience since 1979 in Vietnam, and they were essentially beaten back by a bunch of Vietnamese militia, China is probably looking at this conflict in the Strait of Hormuz. They're looking at what Israel tried to do against Hamas, and they're looking at Russia's failures in Ukraine, and they are probably wondering, you know what? Maybe we can't fix her. Maybe war is just that girl that nobody is ever going to be able to fix.